Welcome to another episode of Life Distilled. Once again, we're here at Montgomery Distillery, and today we're honored to have as our guest Dr. Steve Running, Professor Emeritus from the University of Montana, and at one point, a member of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct.
Dr. Running, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, this is great fun.
So, first of all, we always like to start off with make a note of the fact that we've got a delicious cocktail here from Montgomery Distillery. I had the Bloody Mary. Seemed like a good thing for a cool day today. What did you have?
You have to remind me.
Damiana Dermy, was that it?
Damiana Dermy.
And I failed to look to see what's in there, but it looks delicious.
Yeah, it's real good for a Sunday afternoon.
So with this program, as I was kind of telling you before, we like to apply the notion of distilling and the idea of distilling your life down to all sorts of aspects of one's life. Distilling your life down to what is, kind of basically the most essential to you as a person. And we find these conversations are better over a cocktail, which is why we have one here. But let me just get right to this right out of the gate, because this is what inspired me to want to have you on here. As a recognized expert in global ecosystem monitoring, is the Earth's climate changing, in your opinion?
Oh, yeah. Yes.
The wind's howling outside today in Missoula, Montana, and it's cold, so it feels like winter, but...
Well, it should be. It's February 11th. So it ought to be cold right now, and it is.
Yeah. How is the climate changing, in your opinion?
Yeah, I don't want to get too pedantic on something like a podcast like this, but certainly from all of our IPCC summaries, we know that the Earth's been trapping all this extra heat energy for 50 years at least, as greenhouse gases have gone up. And so it's different, or of course, in different parts on Earth, but it's absolutely certain that it's warming up. Around Montana, we've warmed up about 2 degrees in the last 50 years, just as an example.
Is that Fahrenheit?
Yeah.
And that's yearly average temperature?
Yeah, that's annual average temperature.
Gotcha.
And so this is well underway. It isn't something just barely starting. Certainly long. We've been following this. I got here in 1979. So it's virtually the whole time I've lived in Missoula, global warming has been getting going and underway.
What do you think's causing it? You mentioned greenhouse gases.
Oh yeah, the physics of this is really quite cut and dried. A guy named Svante Arrhenius got the Nobel Prize in 1896 for explaining this. So this is physics that's well understood, that there's certain molecules, CO2 and methane are molecules of this type that let sunlight through the atmosphere but block some of the thermal energy coming back up. And so, as I say, this has been well understood, and we know CO2 and methane are going up in the atmosphere from burning fossil fuels. And so this is really, to scientists, this is just a matter of fact situation. No mystery here.
I wanted to circle back to our theme of Life Distilled, because as we were talking right before we started, one of the things I'm aiming to do with this podcast is bring people on who have really dedicated their lives to maybe a particular pursuit and kind of distilled their lives down either down to one field of endeavor or a certain way of living. So how is it that you got into science in the first place? You mentioned you came here in 1979, but what brought you into science?
Well, I was a forest ecologist in my graduate training, and so I went to Oregon State and then PhD work at Colorado State. And when I came to Missoula, I was hired to teach tree biology. And so I wasn't a global climate scientist at all in my earlier work. But I did start very early on into computer modeling of ecosystems. And when NASA decided to start this program of Mission to Planet Earth, as it was called at the time, there was really almost no ecologist that could think globally, but I at least could think with a computer model. So that got me in the door with NASA, you might say, in about 1981. And after that, just progressively, what NASA wanted to study was big stuff, the Earth, the biosphere as a complete system. And so I really spent most of the 1980s thinking myself, how do I get beyond the single leaves that I measured? I look at this, I measured twigs on trees with a little cuvette, just about like this for my PhD work. And so to go from thinking about this twig, how the transpiration rate of this little twig, to how the whole biosphere works, is what I spent most of the 1980s thinking my way through.
Oh yeah. Now that's exciting stuff. You pointed out something in there. I'd heard on another podcast, I can't recall who it was, maybe Tim Ferriss or Joe Rogan, they had Stuart Brand on. And he was talking about this campaign that he had done with this button after the blue marble photograph came. Mm-hmm. And this is actually a pretty new thing in human history, to be able to even have the context of that image of the Earth, as this little ball, this marble floating out in the world, and thus thinking about it as, oh wait, hold on, that's the whole deal?
That's us.
That's it. That's just us right there. And you've kind of seen that all the way from then to now, maybe 10 years later. How do you think the mindset of the world has changed, or can we wrap our minds around that even yet today?
Well, it really is true that when I was a kid, what you thought about the world was looking at Rand McNally maps.
Yeah.
And so we had never been able to get away from Earth far enough to see it as a single entity when I was a kid. And so it was only in the late 1970s as well, and of course as the Apollo program and getting to the moon was our first look back to see the Earth as a whole unit. And I think that's why that's always been called one of the most iconic pictures in history, was what an Earth rise of the Earth coming up over the lunar horizon with the astronauts there. And nowadays it's so easy for people. Everybody can look at Google Earth. There's satellite images all the time. The nightly weather forecast has satellite images. So nowadays it really is pretty easy to think at a large scale at some level, because those sort of images are all over. But that's all happened within the last 30 years.
Yeah. Do you think that people have come along with that, and that their context has? Because it seems like we're still having a difficult time thinking about managing or dealing with the Earth as this one little...
I think people still pretty much think about their backyard most of the time.
Right.
And so even though they at some intellectual level can look at these big images or pictures of the whole Earth, I think when it gets down to it, they still, their hands-on sense of the world around them is pretty much what they see out their window. I know when I give public lectures and I tell them that when Mount St. Helens went off, the ash cloud came over Missoula and we could see the ash right on the street. Well, 12 days later it came back around. And so I said, think of what that tells us. That tells us that the atmosphere goes around the entire planet in less than 2 weeks.
Oh, wow.
And that tells us why, if China emits carbon way over there, it's here a week later. And so we're all in this together because the atmosphere is mixing around the entire planet at a very rapid rate. And people are always quite amazed to hear that.
Yeah, I'm a little surprised to hear that it makes it all the way around. I had been flying in an airplane to Alaska, and you could see the smog from China floating up towards Alaska when you looked way out to sea.
Yep.
And I remember that Mount St. Helens Day. That's a day that sticks in my mind because we were up on a mountain getting firewood, And no radios, no cell phones
Right.
at that time. We're way up the Yak, Montana, in the middle of nowhere. And we looked to the horizon and just this big, dark, ominous as far as the eye could see. And my parents were like, we better get down from this mountain. And so by the time we got home, which was about 20 miles, the ash was falling right there in the yard.
And you turn on the radio and it's all anybody was talking about.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, I was in a similar situation. I was out with a field trip and a bunch of students and had the radio turned off. And we saw this cloud coming that didn't look like a thundercloud. It didn't look quite right. And then as it got to us, it wasn't cold, it was warm. And the minute you turned the radio on, you found out why.
You knew what was
But for about 10 or 20 minutes there, as you first noticed it, till you turned the radio on, you were pretty clueless. What is going on?
Yeah, it was a remarkable time, and it sticks in my mind for sure.
Yep.
I think something you said there was real key to the conversation, in that people can really look at their backyard mostly is all they can do, and I think that's why we hear comments about the weather come in this conversation about climate change.
Yeah.
And so you'll hear all the time folks say, well, I mean, it's snowing like crazy in DC, it's cold, this is the worst winter we ever had, 40 feet of snow. Obviously the climate is not changing.
People stop me in the grocery store that know what I do around town. This is a small town.
Yeah.
And they say, Dr. Running, it's cold as hell. What's with the global warming? And I think they do it 3/4 as a joke. But I think it's still a point of confusion for a lot of people, because they imagine if it's warming, it just every single day ought to be warmer. And of course, that isn't true to begin with, that every single day is warmer. But the other thing they always tend to forget is they're only looking at Missoula, Montana. The very day that it's 10 degrees here, in Australia, it's boiling hot. And so this is global warming, not just local warming that the science is about. And the other side of the world can be having heat waves while we have a blizzard. And that's totally expected.
Yeah, it's, I mean, all these fluid things in the planet, like the ocean and the atmosphere, they're always trying to balance all that. So it would make a lot of sense to me, just a layperson with high school physics and chemistry, say that, if it's getting hotter here, well, at some point that's going to move and it's going to shift something else and make that want to try to balance itself all out across the board, so that it can hit an equilibrium somewhere, maybe in the averages. The argument that we often hear when you kind of get in that group of folks that are disbelievers of this is that, well, the Earth goes through cycles, and at one point there were dinosaurs, and it was hot everywhere, and it was really humid, and the entire Earth was 82 degrees. What's your take on that position? What's the flaw in that thinking?
Yeah, there's an array of denier claims, I'll call them, that have been well worn. They've been around for years. There's a really good website that one by one takes each one of these ideas and says, well, here's the reality, and it's called skepticalscience.com. And so it's actually comes out of Australia, and they just one by one go through all the different queries and arguments that are put up, and because these have been hashed over 1 million times. And of course there's been natural variation forever. Some of the most repeated variation comes from these Milankovitch cycles, which is literally just little wobbles in the Earth's orbit that are completely well known and understood. Some of the bigger events in history we know are from catastrophic events, and the two that are common in the Earth history are gigantic volcanoes and asteroid strikes. And of course that's what wiped out the dinosaurs, and so we know variation occurs. We better hope one of those kind of variations doesn't occur. But these scientists have sorted all this out years ago, and what we're doing now is we're generating a pulse of trapped energy in the system that's faster by a factor of 1,000,000 than any normal natural variability. I like to tell people that the coal and oil in the ground took 100 million years to accumulate and solidify, and we're digging it all up in 100 years and burning it. So 100 million years going in and 100 years going out. And let's talk about system imbalances. I mean, that just inherently tells you that that system is going to be imbalanced tremendously when all of that carbon comes back out in 100 years.
Because you're essentially moving it from potential energy into kinetic energy in the form of heat in the system?
Yeah, well, we're moving it from I guess, dormant chemical energy in the ground to active thermal energy as you burn it and put it in the atmosphere. So 100 million years worth. You got to remember, coal and oil is photosynthesis of plants. Millions of years ago. So it's basic coal photosynthesis, but it's 100 million years worth. And of course, it's been chemically transformed underground over the eons. And we're digging all that up and putting it back in the atmosphere and 1,000,000 times faster than any natural system would do.
I was discussing climate change with a friend of mine, and he said, "I just don't believe it." And my response was, "So you think that you're more knowledgeable than these folks that have dedicated their entire lives and they spend every day, just like you spend every day, doing financial stuff for IPOs, and you're an expert about that. They spend all their day doing, and yet you doubt them and even discredit their work. What do you think that is all about?"
Well, I think having watched this I've been giving public talks for probably close to 20 years now on this. I think the real cornerstone of this whole issue is that our whole lifestyles has been built on fossil fuels, and we've all enjoyed a tremendously better life than before fossil fuels came along. An awful lot of people get their paycheck directly or indirectly from the fossil fuel industry and related industries. So I can see that this is a threat, an existential threat to a lot of people's sense of well-being. I can understand that. And yet the thing is, it doesn't change the physics any. And so it is too bad that in something like this, people, the thought of what we have to do to get out of it seems so impossible to them that it's easier to just deny the whole thing rather than try to think through what we ought to be doing next.
You know, I think you nail it there. I mean, that's at least my own opinion, that just what you said is exactly right, that it's so frightening what is required of us, that it's much easier just to say, well, that sounds like bunk, and you know, it won't be too bad. I read your piece about the 5 stages of climate grief, which I found cited by quite a few folks. Bill Nye had done a little bit on it, and there was a lot of it.
It's been around. I posted that in 2007, and it's funny. I tried to send it to the New York Times as an editorial. That didn't work.
No.
And in today's world, you just post it.
Yes.
And if the thinking is good, then it gets around.
Right.
And so.
No, it was wonderful, and I personally have definitely gone through the 5 stages, and I try to put myself in that fifth stage, but I often find myself in 3 and 4, you know, in anger and in
I slide backwards all
depression.
the time, I'm sorry to say.
I find I personally, like just a week ago or so, I really got anxious about the whole matter. And I was like, why am I going to work to do something that is, I really don't, I don't know that it's helping anything in particular. It's just it's just perpetuating the system when there's all this work to be done, figuring out this problem. And I almost wanted to just sit on my hands and do nothing. What do you think we should do? What kind of strategy could we implement?
Well, it is pretty easy to get pretty fatalistic especially in this last year of politics where we've got national leaders that are doing everything they possibly can to turn backwards every single aspect about energy transition that they can get a hold of. And it can be, I guess, I've had this asked of me many times in various ways after giving climate talks. Dr. Running, how can you just think about this all day, every day? And the first thing I'll admit is I get times where I'll bet I'm clinically depressed and I just don't know it or care to admit it. I like to hope it doesn't last too long, but I mean, I get pretty bummed out sometimes, especially when certain events occur. I've had a couple of friends that are ER docs, and I've asked them kind of a similar question. How do you go to work? And the minute you get to work, there's just blood and guts everywhere, and people are wheeled in front of you that are just, you know, near death. And how do you do it? Why don't you just crack? And they say that what you do is you zone in kind of a professional hypnosis where you lock yourself into your job. My job is to save this person, and you just don't let emotions and things like that derail you. You focus so hard on getting your job done that you don't allow your brain to drift away into how sorry this situation is. And of course, a lot of their patients do die right in front of them. And I wonder if I do the same and don't really know the psychology of it, is that I have focused for a long time on just studying and working on what's going on in the Earth system, what's humanity need to start getting at it, and I keep a level of professional detachment that must be kind of the same as the way these ER docs do it.
Yeah, it makes sense. It makes sense. I really like what you said there because I really feel the same way. Also, my wife and I got into this heated discussion about this topic, and I was just like, everybody just needs to stop. Like, nobody go to work. We just all stop for a moment and do a big reboot. And she was like, that's never going to work. I mean, that would be chaos, Armageddon. Yep. But then I found this little bit of light of hope, although I don't see it in implementation or really happening right now. But where you said there's a need for visionary national leadership, a Marshall-level plan of national focus and commitment, so everyone is contributing and the lifestyle changes are broadly shared and become a new norm. And I would really tend to agree. Where do you think we're going to find a leader like that that's willing to step up there and say, there's nothing else that I'm going to talk to you guys about other than the fact that we need to change our lifestyle here?
Well, you know, I think we already have some of those leaders. And the first mistake we don't want to fall into is expect that our president is always going to be that leader, because they haven't been in the past. Even Bill Clinton wasn't all that engaged with climate at the time, and of course George Bush certainly wasn't, and then Obama only came into it later after he'd worked on things like healthcare, and of course now we have this. And so looking to the president for leadership, it'd be nice if that would occur, but it isn't essential. We have somebody like the Pope that billions of people is a global leader. He is fully engaged on this topic. We have other national leaders around the world. As you get more regional and local, we have some like Jerry Brown in California that is fully engaged in this, and so much of what the U.S. does is it follows California on trend setting of all types, good and bad.
Right.
And so we have some leaders already. We have actually, I mean, maybe I'm just have to think this through so I don't go nuts. But we've made a lot of progress in the last decade or so.
Yeah.
Think of LED light bulbs. Those are unbelievable how important those are in reducing electricity demand. There's something like 1 trillion light bulbs in the US. 1 trillion. And as we swap each one of those out for an LED, then that's a massive amount of energy saved. LEDs weren't even around meaningfully 10 years ago.